Hello all, today we are talking about the Renaissances. Now, no. The idea of Renaissance is complicated and it's full of problems of interpretation and definition. Historians working on the problem of the Renaissance have never been able to quite decide when the period began or when it ended, although they all admit that a Renaissance did indeed occur. Some see it beginning in the 12th century, while others the 14th century. Historians are a breed, as we've seen already, quite concerned with periodization. But I think as rough dates from sometime in the 1300s to around 1600 and the start of the end of the 16th century, well, I would say that this is the period of the Renaissance. If you want to call it 1350 to 1600 or so, that's 1300 to 1600, sure. Larger than questions of periodization loom, however. And questions such as, if there was such a thing as the Renaissance, regardless of when it began or when it ended, for whom was the Renaissance a Renaissance? Did it affect all people at the same time? Or was its impact felt only on a relatively small number of people in northern Italian city-states, in France or England and Holland? These are the questions that historians debate, because certainly, to be sure, when we're talking about Renaissance, we are talking about a blossoming of cultural production, and that cultural production is evidence of and made possible by great concentrations of wealth, and that by those concentrations weren't distributed evenly. Generally, when we speak of the Renaissance, people talk about plural, because we recognize now it affected different people differently. Essentially, we should say, or quite generally, they played out differently in the South, where we talk more about cultural production, than in the North, where we see perhaps a greater emphasis on Christian humanism and piety in particular, although there is also quite a bit of our Northern artistic production that we'll take a look at. So historians generally talk about a Northern Renaissance, and they're talking very much about Erasmus. There's an English Renaissance, Dutch Renaissance, Spanish Renaissances. It wasn't just about Italy, although certainly the Italian Renaissance is sort of the cameo Renaissance when people talk about Renaissances. Today, I'll be giving most of our attention to the Italian Renaissance. What was the Renaissance? Well, it's somewhat ironic that this very forward, progressive movement that gets so much credit for planting seeds of a more modern outlook was originally backward-looking. The expression Renaissance, I should say, is a value-charged expression because it carries with it a whole series of connotations that go beyond a simple meaning of rebirth. The expression Dark Ages, of course, is also quite value-changed. Do you come from a period of darkness or come from a period of light? The fact that certain individuals decided to call this period from roughly 500 to 1300-ish an age of darkness shows that they thought their own period was a period of light. The consensus among scholars today is that the Renaissance represents a distinct cultural period lasting from the 14th to 16th century. It's centered on the revival of classical learning. As I said, historians disagree about its significance, but they generally understand it to represent something of the complex changes that characterize the passing from medieval society into modernity. And again, just to, in very broad strokes, when I think about Renaissance and Renaissance humanism, there's two main notions I want to communicate to you. One, it begins very much grounded in a recovery of classical civilization, It's a literary movement, it is an artistic flourishing, and it turns into civic humanism, where these values manifest in how public spaces are used and public participation. And it is, in addition to that, return to the classics, it is very much characterized by a celebration of man, a celebration of individual potential of individuals, a sort of optimism about it. And one 19th century historian, Jakob Burckhardt, who wrote a very famous interpretation on the Renaissance. In it, he found, in this period, he found the discovery of the individual and the origins of modern secular society. So that's some big claims. But now let's move back and delve into this history. This point that this was a period that was self-consciously defined by contemporaries. It wasn't, in retrospect, people came back and said, hey, it looks like, look at all that activity, let's label that something. People in their own time understood themselves to be living in a new age of lightness. And one example I would give from my own research, my first book is very much about trade in the early modern world, and one of the commodities that I've studied in depth is the trade in rhubarb. Not rhubarb for being traded for rhubarb pies in the early modern period, before sugar was a widely available and cheap commodity that came about as a result of the plantation economies of the Atlantic early modern world. Before that, sugar wasn't readily available or inexpensive at all. And people weren't making pies out of rhubarb. What they were using rhubarb for was medicine, and the rhubarb root was it was an important gastrointestinal medicine. At any rate, one Renaissance writer, Guido Pensaroli, who lived in the 16th century, wrote a book. He wrote a book in the 16th century where he took inventory of what the world had gained and lost. And he titled this book, "The History of Many Memorable Things Lost and an Account of Many Excellent Things Found." And he had these 22 chapters on the wonders of modernity. And fourth in his list, he listed rhubarb, this wonderful medicine. So there, you know a little bit about the history of rhubarb, but I share this with you more to show you an example of someone self-consciously understanding themselves to be in a new modern period, different from an ancient period. To be sure, however, they traded rhubarb in ancient times as well, but he's listing it as one of the innovations of modernity. He's not the first to make that sort of an error. At any rate, so the Renaissance consists of a recovery of classical civilization and a celebration of man. And one way that I invite you to think about it is that the Renaissance, it begins on the page. We're talking about texts. It jumps to the canvas. We'll see a flourishing of all kinds of artwork. And then it moves to public spaces, and where we'll get into ideas of civic humanism. And with humanism, that is a good place to start. The Renaissance very much begins with humanism. Humanism is a literary and linguistic movement cultivated in particular during the Renaissance and founded on the revival of classical Latin and Greek texts, styles, and values. And one of those values was the value of humanitas, or humaneness. And Renaissance humanists very much looked to Cicero, the great Roman orator who lived in the 2nd to 1st century BCE, as kind of humanist number one. And Cicero developed a doctrine of humanitas, or humaneness, the quality of humanity. He expressed an ideal for human life based on generous and honest treatment of others, and a commitment to morality based on natural law, the rights that belong to all people because they are human beings. independent of the differing laws and customs of different societies. That language is probably a bit too contemporary. You could take a course on the history of human rights where people really debate when this develops as an idea. And if you might be thinking, what's the difference between, practicing humanitas and honoring universal human rights? And you would be asking an excellent question, because we are living in a world where slavery exists when we're studying these centuries. At any rate, let us not let the gap between aspiration and practice lead us to entirely disregard the aspiration at work. The spirit of humanitas that Cicero passed on to later Western civilization was one of the ancient world's most attractive ideas. And so we see humanism as a movement emerges in the 14th century. In 14th century Italy, with an elite group of intellectuals, mostly men and laymen. But recall that, and now I want to complicate this idea about, in the Renaissance, people rediscover the classics, and we see this break, this disjuncture. And I want to point to some of the roots that some other people have seen in the medieval period. If we recall, the founding ideas of the Cistercians and the Franciscans was an emphasis on the humanity of Christ. And therefore, it's fair to say that some of the roots of humanism can be traced to the more emotional and personal relationships with Christ that people like Bernard of Clairvaux and Francis of Assisi strived for. Medieval curriculum is developing in universities and takes off in this period of the Renaissance, where the studies of the humanities is being developed. Curricula focusing on Latin, Greek, grammar, literature, dialectic, history, philosophy. And many of the people studying this are, as I've mentioned before, they're administrators. They're not just going to be clergy, they're going to be working for governments and run municipalities. And they thought that recovering this classical tradition, its knowledge and its virtues, would help them be better leaders. Right there, we see some of these threads that seeds that blossom in civic humanism. While we're thinking in this cursory way about some of the links between humanism and the medieval period, we might point to scholasticism as well. What's the relationship of scholasticism to humanism? Generally put, some historians have said we might associate scholasticism with Aristotle and humanism with Plato. I think that's too a bit too simplistic, but Renaissance intellectuals, they rejected the thinking of schoolmen scholastics like Thomas Aquinas and Abelard, the author of Sic et Non, whose reliance on Aristotelian logic they found too rigid. In some ways, there's a dissonance between scholasticism and humanism that revives classical debates between Aristotle and Plato. If we were to think about Aristotle as, yes, philosopher, I'm simplifying here, but Aristotle as observer of the natural world, kind of a proto-scientist, and Plato very much philosopher, thinking in terms of abstract forms and concepts. And many of these philosophical and epistemological, et cetera, questions had been in tension in Greek philosophy, and we see these tensions revived at some point. While much of the Renaissance is grounded in an Aristotelian observation cum celebration of the natural world, many Renaissance thinkers were also drawn to Plato's meditations and thoughts on perfect forms, as opposed to perhaps Aristotle's more pragmatic approach to reality. Anyway, I'll leave all that there. We won't kind of delve farther into both the medieval roots of the Renaissance and how we would situate Aristotle and Plato in these developments. But at any rate, the Renaissance, it begins with a tremendous appreciation of classical authors. The humanist scholars of the 14th, 15th, 16th century, they start to learn Greek, whereas many of the Greek classical text had come to Europe translated from Arabic into Latin. Now we see an increasing interest in reading Greek, to read texts in their original form. That's what I mean, begins on the page. It's a literary movement. And now I'm going to give you some examples of the type of celebratory perspective on classical thinking. One Italian philosopher, excuse me, Marsilio Ficino, in states 1433 to 1499, he wrote a letter to his friend, Paul of Middelburg, and the letter is instructive for what it says about Ficino's attitude towards his own age as well as an age that is past. Here's an excerpt from the letter. He writes, "If we are to call any age golden, it is beyond doubt that age which brings forth golden talents in different places. That such is true of this our age, no one will hardly doubt. For this century, like a golden age, has restored to light the liberal arts, which were almost extinct: grammar, poetry, rhetoric, painting, sculpture, architecture, music, and all this in Florence, achieving what had been honored among the ancients, but almost forgotten since. The age has joined wisdom with eloquence, and prudence with the military art. This century appears to have perfected astronomy. In Florence, it has recalled the Platonic teaching from darkness into light. And in Germany, there have been invented the instruments for printing books." Yes, the printing press is a 15th century technology, real game changer. In general, these humanists, they really love these classical authors. It even gets a little creepy. Wait and see. Here's an example. In 1416, the scholar Poggio Bracciolini and his friends found in a Swiss monastery a long-lost complete text of a book by the Roman orator Quintilian, called The Training of an Orator. And here, in the oblivion of a Swiss monastic library, wrote Poggio, intentionally confounding the author and the book, he was being kept prisoner. Doesn't mean the author of the book. He was being kept prisoner, and Bracciolini had found the prisoner still safe and sound amid a head of valuable and neglected volumes, though filthy with mold and dust in a sort of foul and gloomy dungeon at the bottom of one of the towers. These are his words, not mine. Do you sense this idea of darkness into light, of recovering a lost past, of a new awakening? And he goes on, he says, "At the sight of countless books kept like captives, and the library neglected and infested with dust, worms, soot, we all burst into tears." And their humanist friend Leonardo Bruni responded to this letter they sent of discovery, and he wrote congratulations. He said, "For Quintilian, who used to be mangled and in pieces, will recover all his parts through you." Here's another example. Petrarch, one of our most famous humanists who lives in the 14th century, really at the forefront of this humanist movement. Among his works are letters to dead authors and poems. His introduction on great men praises the greatness of the ancients. He actually wrote letters to Cicero, Seneca, Quintilian, Virgil, Homer, and he dated these letters from the world above. Erasmus, one of the most prominent figures of the Northern Renaissance, wrote that, quote, "Whatever is pious and conduces to good manners ought not to be called profane." And here he's talking about, this is a Christian world. We are large in Christendom, and these folks are pagans. So for Erasmus, this is a little bit of trying to make sense of what is profane and what is sacred. If an earlier meaning meant profane, outside the temple, not sacred, Erasmus quote of saying, whatever's pious and conduces to good manners ought not to be called profane. He wants to elevate, elevate these classical thoughts and ideas that are outside of Christian theology. A less heady example, perhaps, and this is back to maybe a little bit creepy, is that some Italian intellectuals, or I don't mean to say creepy, but some Italian intellectuals would celebrate the birthdays of Cicero and Plato. They'd get together and have a birthday party for them. Have you ever had a birthday party for George Washington? At any rate. So who were some of these first major humanists? Well, one of them is, as I mentioned, well, one of them is Dante, who is a 13th and 14th century writer, so it's very much still late medieval, and he's most famous for this very long narrative poem he wrote, which he tells in the first person. This is kind of a story of his imaginary allegorical travel through hell, purgatory, and to heaven, where he encounters various deceased souls. And it is this 14,233 line poem that can be read at many levels. And some scholars have argued, wait, don't claim this to the Renaissance. This is actually a very medieval piece of work. But if here's one Renaissance flavor in it, is that Dante's escort on his journal is Virgil, a figure from the classical world. And this poem, by the way, is written in the vernacular. You'll see more of that in the early modern period. Martin Luther is going to translate the Bible into German in a way of reaching the people, which I think associates with this idea of, human optimism, a regard and a celebration of human potential. Let's write things so everyone who can read, and the majority of people still can't, but that people can read things in their own language. They need not learn this Latin language, so to speak, to read anything. So Dante is one of our central humanists. Petrarch, Francesco Petrarch, who lives 1304 to 1374, is also a very famous humanist. And I have to come clean here that Petrarch's writings in some ways sent me, catalyzed an intellectual journey that for me continues. And the text that I'll just share a little bit of with you is an excerpt from his Ascent up Mont Ventoux. And here is a picture of Mont Ventoux. And it may be that he actually didn't climb this mountain. Centuries ago, there were probably more trees on it. And that if he didn't climb it, it's written more as an allegory. But let me share with you some words that struck me many years ago. And that is, Petrarch writes, "For pleasure alone he climbed Mont Ventoux, which rises more than 6,000 feet beyond Vaucluse. It was no great feat, of course, but he was the first recorded alpinist of modern times, the first to climb a mountain merely for the delight of looking up from its top, or almost the first, for in a high pasture he met a good old shepherd." And these aren't Petrarch's words, of course. This is an account of his supposed travels, at any rate. He met an old shepherd who said that 50 years before he had attained the summit and got nothing for it, save the toil and repentance and torn clothing. Petrarch, however, was dazed and stirred by the view of the Alps, the mountains around Lyon, the Rhone, the Bay of Marseille. He took St. Augustine's Confessions from his pocket. He climbed this mountain, and he marveled at the sunshine, at the sound of birds singing, at the strain on his muscles as he moved himself up the hill, kind of very much reveling in this human experience of climbing this mountain and then appreciating the beautiful view that he had attained from his efforts. And when he got to the top of the mountain, he just happened to have with him a copy of St. Augustine's Confessions in his pocket. And he took it out, and and as he took it out of his pocket, it opened automatically to the page where Patriarch's eyes are immediately drawn to the following words. And the words that Augustine had written so many centuries before were these: "And men go about to wonder at the heights of the mountains and the mighty waves of the sea and the wide sweep of the rivers and the circuit of the ocean and the revolution of the stars, but themselves they consider not." Now, Patriarch's response in this moment is to turn out away from the outer world of nature and to the inner world of the soul. The point when Patriarch writes that is he is chagrined. He writes, and these are Patriarch's words: "I closed the book, angry with myself that I should still be admiring earthly things who might long ago have learned from even the pagan philosophers that nothing is wonderful but the soul, which, when great itself, finds nothing great outside itself. Then in truth I was satisfied that I had seen enough of the mountain. I turned my inward eye upon myself, and from that time not a syllable fell from my lips until we reached the bottom again. We look about us for what is to be found only within. How many times, think you, did I turn back that day to glance at the summit of the mountain, which seemed scarcely a cubit high compared with the range of human contemplation?" So here again, there's a real tension. We have Patriarch in very much enjoying a natural experience, very much reveling in the natural world and how his own body can move through it, but then drawn back to the interiority and the spirituality of what the church father Augustine told him, that he should focus on himself, but then recalls that the ancients too think that there's nothing greater than virtue, and then turns and decides that he will devote himself to a self-examination of his own soul, which is in some ways, if Burckhardt said we were seeing the discovery of the individual, that Patriarch is still in a very spiritual way, is deciding that focusing on his own soul is a very important endeavor. And yet, despite his professed commitment to inward contemplation, there's something undeniably of this world in his climb and in what the Renaissance celebrates. And for me personally, I said this text had a big impact on me. When I read that text as an undergraduate, I was thinking, gosh, I'll skip church and feel a little bit less guilty if I go on a hike and enjoy the natural world of God's creation, was the way I explained it to my justified skipping church to myself. And it occurred to me that reading this text, whether he actually climbed the mountain or not, made me think about how did people relate to nature and think about nature? Was it something to be beaten back or something to be cared for? And that led to my first major history project, thinking about medieval attitudes towards nature. And I've been pursuing history projects ever since. So careful what you read. At any rate, so we have Dante, Petrarch, Boccaccio, the author of the Decameron that we talked about in the context of the Black Death, that's a set of stories of escaping as they hunkered down during a lockdown, also a 14th century book. And so these are some of our most prominent early humanists, and these early humanists very much devote themselves to translations of the classics. Some of the quotes I read to you kind of indicated how wonderful you found this text. You're going to recover it and copy it so the whole world can be enlightened by it. And some of that, now I want to revisit a topic we talked about a little bit when we talked about Charlemagne. Some of that translation, those textual translations led to discoveries with historical consequences. And one scandalous consequence of that literary interest in old texts concerns the donation of Constantine. And the donation of Constantine, now we regard it as one of the greatest historical hoaxes of all time. And basically, these documents had been forged maybe at Charlemagne's court sometime in the 760s, that said that back in the 300s, the Emperor Constantine that Edict of Milan, Constantine, Battle of Milvian Bridge, in the 300s, had donated to the Pope in Rome the imperial crown, cloak, and rank, along with the Roman and Western Roman Empire. How convenient for raising the prestige of Rome. Now, the truth is that the church only officially acquired those papal lands in the 750s, seemingly just a little bit before this document was forged. And they acquired them when Pepin of the Franks had given them to the church as a gift. 756 also appears to be the time, around the time when this first donation appears, and it was probably created by a cleric either in Rome or up in the Frankish court, and its purpose may have been to allow the papacy to claim that it had jurisdiction over a land through this precedent, or to promote the idea that the king, he was returning, not giving the papal lands to the church. But nonetheless, this fiction of a donation added to the legitimacy of a convenient political marriage between the Catholic Church and the Frankish state that endured for centuries. The donation was only revealed, this document saying Charlemagne had donated these lands to the Pope, was only revealed to be a forgery in 1440. In that year, in 1440, Lorenzo Valla published a discourse on the forgery of the alleged donation of Constantine, in which he enumerated a large number of historical anachronisms that pervaded the work. For instance, this document referred to Byzantia as a province, when in the 4th century that term wasn't used and it was still only a city. It referred to the temples in Rome that did not yet exist, and it referred to Judea, even though in Constantine's time, the Romans referred to that territory as Palestinia. And Valla could have added that the emperor Constantine never had leprosy, making it impossible for Pope Sylvester to have cured him of the disease. Anyway, at the time in the Renaissance, Valla's discovery was one more thing that undermined the church's credibility. Remember, we talked about the crises for the papacy in the 14th century? Well, in the 15th century, this event didn't help at all. The Catholic Church actually suppressed Valla's work for years, and centuries later, only centuries later, it finally conceded publicly that the donation of Constantine was in fact a fake. And so I want to just pause on that as a remarkable case of historical analysis. Now, truth be told, some people that had read the text previously had noticed problems with it as well. So there's, as always, it's a little bit of a more complicated history. Lorenzo Valla doesn't get all the credit, but good for him for doing his homework about it. And this remarkable case of how do you analyze a text? Oftentimes, analyzing a text, there are certain things just going on within the text that might raise flags and prompt you to ask questions that you can answer. But so often what I find is that in order to analyze a text, you actually need to know something about the context in which that text was produced, that it's only inserting it into its context that we can generate more meaningful analyses. And in this case, that he's seeing these names that don't pertain to the time, like it couldn't have been written then because no one used those terms. And so that kind of analysis depended on his contextual knowledge, on something he knew, some knowledge that he brought to reading this document that couldn't be found in the document itself. As you might keep this in mind as you work on your third and final papers, analyzing documents about a given moment. Okay, at any rate, so meanwhile, the context of that literary discovery was kings are getting more powerful, the economy is changing, the papacy is taking a hit, and the papacy will continue to make hits and take hits, many of them well-deserved. Here's one example. The Borgia Pope Alexander VI, who married his daughter Lucergia to three of Italian's rulers and carved out a state for one of his sons, was one of the most notorious examples of papal corruption. If the Pope was supposed to be the leader of the faith, helping the flock attain salvation, and to promote God's work on earth. The Renaissance papacy was in many ways very, very embedded in the world. It has armies, it conducts wars, it does this sort of business jockeying for political power, as we saw the Borgia Pope Alexander VI doing. This isn't quite the mission. And when we talk about the Reformation, that's one of the that's one of the things that reformers like Martin Luther are going to be quite dismayed with. So, begins on the page and it jumps to the canvas. Here I'm just going to go really quickly and show you some pictures of Renaissance art. Here we have Decameron, a painting by Botticelli, capturing the Decameron, a picture imagining a scene from the Decameron. Here we have another Botticelli, Springtime Primavera with Greek goddesses. Again, the content isn't religious here. The content is pagan, even, if you will. Or other Renaissance art is grounded more in the experience of individuals and humans. Here is a one of the most famous paintings, you've all seen it, the Mona Lisa by Leonardo da Vinci. I could have put out the Corona Lisa meme that's maybe been circulating, but anyway. So here's a portrait of Lisa Gherardini, the wife of a Florentine merchant who commissioned this painting, who could draw okay, as we heard from his previous letter, to paint a picture of his wife. That said, and then here is Madonna Lita, which is also painted by Leonardo, and it is a picture of Mary with Christ. And I put this here as a reminder that for all of the one of the real innovations and developments here is that artists are painting things that aren't strictly religiously themed, but make no mistake, the Madonna and Child is still the most painted image in the Renaissance. I've heard it said. And now, and here is a picture of one of Leonardo da Vinci's famous sketches of the human body, in some ways drawing our attention to this celebration of man and of human potential. And that made its way into sculpture, a good deal of which was in public spaces. Here is Michelangelo's early 16th century portrait of David, which you can see in Spain, which you can see in Florence. And here is the skyline of Florence featuring Brunelleschi's dome. And this dome has, I think, is a great example to put before you of what we mean when we talk about civic humanism and how the Renaissance maybe went from the page to the canvas to public spaces in a wonderful manifestation of the celebration of human potential. This dome was the result of a contest put before the citizens of Florence to see who could submit the best plan, and it would be judged accordingly. And so we kind of see this grassroots cultivation of human potential in the community that gives way to quite fine architecture. We need to ask the question, why does the Renaissance happen now? Especially if it's so focused on the classics, why is it happening now? Well, universities have been founded in the medieval era, and they are growing and developing curriculum. There's a revival of universities have been developing their curriculum very much along humanistic lines, but this doesn't entirely get us to why. And full disclaimer, won't entirely get us to why, but here are some of the ways in which historians have explained it. So there's a revival of ideas from the classical world that are emerging amidst a real disillusionment with the times. And we said it's hard for us to get our head around how much the impugnment of the papacy's reputation might matter, but that is something that is afoot. Patriarch's dad is exiled from Florence, and he actually grows up in Avignon, and he is the one that coins the phrase Babylon captivity. Now, so that's sort of maybe a cultural explanation that there's this widespread disillusionment, but one type of explanation that I am often inclined to follow is following the money. And what we see so now I'll offer a sort of economic and political explanation for why the Renaissance happens when it happens and why it happens in Italy. Now, the 100 Years' War, it lasts a long time. And as you know from our lecture on the military revolution, to field an army, kings need more and more money. And one of the things they do is raise taxes. Another thing they do is take loans and borrow money. And kings from England and from France, they borrowed money quite a bit from banking houses that had been emerging in Florence, in Italy, on the Mediterranean. This is kind of the heart of vibrant trade that's connecting to what we call silk roads over into the farther east. And so you have a good amount of wealth. And these are places where kings and princes to the north know they can get loans. Well, over the course of the 100 Years' War, you actually had one of the biggest banking houses in Florence collapsed when because of default on its war loans to the English and French kings. Both kings, they didn't pay it back. And you had banks with those loans that they had no way of recouping their funds. They didn't have an army at their disposal. And so Bardi and Peruzzi, the largest banking house in Europe, went bankrupt in 1343 to 1345. And so they're a little less reluctant to lend out the capital they have to unreliable debtors. And in the meantime, the conquest of Constantinople by the Ottoman Turks happens in 1453. We've seen this map before. They've kind of moved across into Eastern Europe, and then the last shred of the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, falls when Constantinople is sacked in 1453. And as a result of that, the East is also looking like a riskier investment. And so you have big Italian bankers who are a little bit reluctant to send their money to the north where they're not going to pay back. And now the East is looking risky for a while. Trade doesn't totally die and it'll pick up again. But for the meantime, there's this moment where they're more interested in investing their money locally. And in the meantime, the Greek conquest is bringing all kinds of people that have had access to have had access to older texts and classical traditions, and so it's a kind of very verdant moment. And so what you have is all this money getting spent in Italy, and it's getting spent on courts and on patronage of things like art. And then you make good art and someone wants to buy good art, and someone makes a profit from selling that, and then they go buy other things. And so it kind of feeds on itself. The Reconquista had served as an impetus for connecting scholars in Western Europe with classical works that had been preserved in the Islamic world. And there comes another major impetus as Greek Orthodox scholars move to city-states of Italy. And then there's this relearning of Greek that really gets going. Marsilio Ficino, whom I mentioned above, he published all of Plato's surviving works. And so kind of this combination of a glut, if you will, of liquidity on the Italian peninsula leads to patronage, and the Renaissance flourishes in Italy first. It's more urban, there's more money, there's different political configurations, lots of city-states, so you have a variety of courts all interested in enhancing their own stature and prestige. One way to do that was to have beautiful arts and renowned thinkers at your court. But the flourishing isn't limited strictly to courts. In Florence in 1338, there's 100,000 children that are going to school. 10,000 of these are girls receiving an elementary education. And people have said, is that correlation part of the explanation? And this kind of flourishing feeds on itself. One argument goes that Italy, being more urban, was more concerned with the liberal arts that had practical applications, such as rhetoric for civilian life, than they were with the deep theological questions in the mode of Thomas Aquinas. You know, they were, how do you build Brunelleschi's dome, for example, this beautiful public space that people can appreciate and act in. So make no mistake, though, this movement is funded by commercial growth, and families, wealthy families like the Medicis, for example. We have 3 generations that really just preside over Italy, and they begin as they are the de facto rulers of the Florentine Republic, and then the rulers, they are patrons of the art. They have their hands in it's time. They have their hands in all kinds of industries, and including banking. And so the Medicis, and there's a big economic story here to be aware of. Now, there's another key element or set of elements that about the Renaissance that I have alluded to and maybe mentioned in passing, but I want to pause on this idea and group under this heading of the celebration of man. I mentioned that people had developed studies in the humanities, Latin, Greek, grammar, literature, dialectic history, moral philosophy. And if an overwhelming concern of the 13th century was God and salvation, now there's a bit of a shift, and an overwhelming concern is humanity. No one is abandoning religion, but it took the focus slightly off of salvation, how will I get into heaven, and put it more on man in the world, not man in the cloister. How can man in the world exemplify virtue? And this cracks open the door for scientific thought and learning based on observation that's shareable, repeatable. And we'll see now, we'll see a focus on the personal relationship with God. In some ways, as I mentioned, we saw this with Bernard of Clairvaux. Well, it is going to be a big time focus of the Reformation. What we see the use of one's mind, a God-given human tool to attain knowledge, right? We haven't talked about the Reformation yet, but when we do, one of the things I'll say is it is interested in a number of sects emerge, but some of them are so intent on eliminating hierarchy that they do entirely. A Quaker meeting consists of people gathering in a circle as equals, very different from Pope, Cardinal, Bishop, priest that administers sacraments. And also this idea that every person can read the Bible and understand for him or herself the word of God. In some ways, this we might link and see some of those Reformation fundamentals brought to the world of religion growing out of this celebration of humanity and this focus on humanity that we see in the Renaissance. Now, it's important to keep in mind that all this is happening in a particular layer of society. I'll stop there. But I want to let me just share with you, or not stop there necessarily. But say the idea of civic virtue is very much on the minds of Renaissance Florentines, for example. The Greeks had this idea of excellence. If it all sounds familiar, it should. But there's this notion that there's a dignity in man instead of a wickedness in man. And we see a focus on passages, some historians have looked and said, focuses on passages from Genesis that emphasize that man is made in the likeness of God, that God created humans in his image and his likeness, and declared that good. We see a shift in valence into how people are understanding their religion, like the images of Christ pre and post Crusades, for example. We see Christ as militant warrior, and then we see Christ as suffering son. The theology hasn't changed, but the valence, the way in which the things people are emphasizing about religion does. The experience of Christian religion, again, to make this point I've made before, is not fixed. But about this idea of dignity of man, let me share a few words from people of the time. Giovanni Piccolo della Mirandola wrote a famous text, The Oration on the Dignity of Man, and in which he retells the creation story, writing this: "You, constrained by no limits, in accordance with your own free will, shall ordain for yourself the limits of your nature." Speaking about man, how bold a statement and an idea. Another Florentine humanist wrote a text in which he asked the question, how does man resemble God? And his answer was, in his activity. Consider, he wrote, what men have produced. All homes, all towns, all cities, finally all building in the world. And from this it followed to celebrate and to do, to act, to manifest God in creation, in the creation of paintings, of sculpture, of literature, of science, of discovery, that there's a can-do ethos that emerges, as opposed to be humble, be obedient, recognize your sin. And so now we're moving from it being a literary phenomenon to an artistic phenomenon, moving into the page to public spaces with the Italian Renaissance. There's a celebration of beauty and the human figure, celebrated in a way not seen since the classical period, as I showed you here with David. Brunelleschi's Dome is another example of that. But again, and I'm going to return to this theme, religion is still very much a part of it. And here is a picture of the betrayal of Jesus and Judas in the garden, an early Renaissance painting, kind of depicting that human drama, human story, but religious context. Here's the Adoration of the Magi, and we'll have many of these painted with their patrons, the Medicis, inserted. And here is the Bondoni's meeting of the Golden Gate, the legend of Joachim and Anne, the parents of the Virgin Mary Anne meeting. So we see very much this notion of the for all the secular pagan themes that get portrayed on the canvas, religious themes are very much still there. But these examples I've shown you kind of point to the human stories in the theology, and what, of course, could be more human than the love of a mother for her child. And with that, we will stop and we'll talk more about the Renaissance next time. Bye-bye.